all you heroes and champions, crows, pirates, and inquisitors. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast. I'm Shelby.
And I'm Austin.
And we are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From the Maker to Lyrium to Aravels, we will cover it all. There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hey, Shelby.
Hey, Austin.
You ready to talk about some Dragon Age?
I guess so.
All right, well, today we continue our Countries of Thedas series, which we come with a very, very requested topic today.
Drum roll.
Are you going to tell him?
Oh, I thought you were going to tell him.
No, just anticlimactic drum roll. Why don't you tell him?
Okay, well, we are talking about the dwarves today. And this is going to be another two-part episode. Maybe three, but probably two parts. And today we're talking about Orzammar.
Woohoo! Well, where do we even begin with Orzammar?
That's fair. I have a few fun facts, as I always do. So let's just start there. So Orzammar, I think in the beginning of Dragon Age Origins, when we go to Orzammar, I think there is either a codex or a conversation where we find out that Orzammar is the only city in the Dwarven Empire that's left. But that's actually not true. That we find out that later, I think in a codex. Again, I'm not really sure where we found out all this lore, but you find it out throughout the game. So Orzammar is the biggest, most known Dwarven city that's left, but there's also Kalsharok. Kalsharok is to the far, far, far opposite side of Thedas than Orzammar is. Kalsharok lies under Tevinter, so you can imagine Orzammar is on the border kind of Orlais and Ferelden, and then Kalsharok is on the totally opposite side. So they don't have any contact. And we'll talk more about Kalsharok next week, but Orzammar really thinks that they're the only ones. And I think, personally, that gives them a little bit of a superiority complex. But Orzammar is one of two cities left in the Dwarven Empire, and it is the capital of the empire. I mean, even though the empire doesn't really exist anymore, but it was the capital back when the empire was great. So Orzammar is ruled by a king and a group of nobles who are referred to as the Assembly. And we get to determine all of this kind of stuff throughout the course of Dragon Age Origins. You know, you get to kind of choose which king you're going to support. And you get to meet some of these nobles. You can maybe convince some of them by doing quests. So we get to see all this in Origins. And if you haven't played Origins, I really, really recommend it. Not just because it's my favorite game, but because you get so much lore, especially about the dwarves. So if this is a subject you're interested in, you should definitely play through Origins. Anyways, my last fun fact is that Orzammar is a great thaigs, not just a regular thaigs. And so that means that Orzammar is significantly larger than the other thaigs would have been. It's in a centralized location, and it was just a main center of the Dwarven Empire. So the other great thaigs that we know of include Kalsharok and Kalharal. We'll talk about both of those later. But there were 9 other great thaigs that were considered, a great thaigs, other than these 3. So that means there were 12 in total. And we don't know the names of all of those, but we do know that that's how many existed. So that is a little bit about my brief overview of Orzammar.
It's so interesting because this is the one part of Dragon Age I feel, besides other than humans, but that BioWare really leans into the fantasy trope of this race of dwarves because they from them being underground. But if you look at other fantasy genres, I'm drawing mainly from Lord of the Rings and then the Inheritance Cycle. But in both of those, the Dwarves Empire is a shell of what it once was.
That's true.
And like, I haven't read a lot of the books of Lord of the Rings, which I know that there is a good like section of, dwarven cities, but in really the places that you go in the characters is you go to Moria, as it's been ransacked and it's emptied and everyone's been killed by goblins and orcs. And you also go to wherever they go at the end of the Hobbit movies, where Smaug is. And that's also just inhabited by a dragon. Like, they've been pushed out of these lands, and it just kind of like, it puts the dwarves in kind of this like displacement. But one thing I think BioWare does interesting is that instead of this displacement that happens, the dwarves kind of retreat into themselves. And they kind of just strengthen their whatever it is to be a dwarf in their underground city and have very little communication with the outside world, which is kind of what happens in the Inheritance Cycle. So much that humans in the Inheritance Cycle think dwarfs are a myth because they've never seen them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I definitely agree with you. It's kind of like they thought about this whole really interesting and unique backstory for the elves and the Kunari and just kind of copy-pasted humans and dwarves. Which is fine. I mean, this is the world we live in. This is what we've been given. So, let's talk about the ancient history.
Yeah, let's.
Okay, so last week when we talked about Navarra, we were talking about, this country's so new, like we're barely even in the ancient age, all this stuff. Well, opposite is happening today. We are going back pretty far. So at minus 1170 ancient, King Endrin's Stonehammer moved the capital of the Dwarven Empire to Orzammar from Kal-Sharok. So he did this for a couple reasons. First, this is kind of important backstory. Orzammar before this was like the home of the mining caste and the smith caste families. Like, that was the people that lived in Orzammar were miners and they were blacksmiths. But in Kal-Sharok, it was mostly nobles, like noble families lived in Kal-Sharok. So you have this kind of, not conflict, but like divergence almost between the two groups of dwarves. So he moved to the capital. One of the reasons why is so that he could like kind of preside more directly over like the commercial side of dwarven life, because that's, that was one of the big ways that they kept this thing afloat, through mining, lyrium, of course, and through crafting. So, and in addition to that, because of the turmoil in the Tevinter Imperium following the death of that Archon, there was just a lot of upheaval. So they moved the capital of the Dwarven Empire to Orzammar, and this is a big deal. Kal-Sharok is obviously offended. Orzammar is obviously very excited. But this move kind of foreshadows, I think, or maybe not even foreshadows. It's almost like, what's the word? It's in psychology when you're like, you're already determining the path.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, because it's like, okay, well, we're going to abandon Kal-Sharok because it's not serving us right now. Let's go to Orzammar because they're the center of trade. They're the center of all of our, capitalistic things that make us money. So they move the capital. That's a big deal. And they, start the construction of several construction projects in the city, such as some of our favorite places like the Proving Grounds and or at least the expansion of them, and like Stonehammer Hall, and just all these kind of like big things that we see in Origins.
All right. Yeah. I've got a lot of thoughts.
Already?
Just on that one paragraph. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So, the first thing that I want to talk about is just kind of like, it's kind of building on the whole Countries of Thedas series and really like the major players of the Ancient Age. Because while the Alamari and the Syrian are big players, they're not, I wouldn't say they're the major players of the Ancient Age. So like these cities or whatever that you have in the Ancient Age, or you've got Tevinter, the oldest human empire, budding out in the Ancient Age. Obviously the dwarves are something probably in relation to this lyrium trade, because Tevinter is building itself upon mages.
Right.
And the dwarfs to this day are the ones who know the secrets of mining lyrium.
Right.
Which the Tevinter mages would need for their magic. And then Arlathan is the other major player in the Ancient Age. And so you do have the three players of, you know, elves, humans, and dwarfs. Maybe not as we know them in Dragon Age, because we haven't been to Tevinter yet, but there are there. And they're all kind of centered in the Tevinter area. So like the capital was Kal Shirak before they moved it. Arlathan, I believe, is to the east of Tevinter.
Oh, I think it's west of Tevinter.
Because the Arlathan Forest.
Yeah.
Right? That's near Tevinter, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And so these are the major players. So to me, like King Stonehammer, his move to Orzammar is a huge like political power, because I think at this point he probably realizes, because by 170 ancient, I think the fall of Arlathan has happened.
No. It's not 170. It's 1170.
Oh, 1170. Okay.
Yeah,
so 1170.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's 2500 when Arlathan is built.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that at some point either Arlathan has fallen or it is about to fall. And I'll look back through our timeline to double check that and make sure.
I'm looking up right now.
Okay. But anyway, I'll keep my point. So I think this is either a point where he is either witnessed the fall of the elves, or it's happening, and he decides, okay, well, we will hold some sway if we keep our secrets of lyrium with Tevinter. They will be dependent on us, but let's move our seat of power as far away as we can get.
Right.
And put actual, you know, geographical distance between us and Benrathis.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all.
And so I think one of the reasons that I think that really they do survive and have Orzammar at all is because King Stonehammer moves them there to fortify it. And then it's too much of it. By the time Tevinter would move on Orzammar, they're dealing with Andraste's rebellion.
Right.
Anyway, that was just my thought of like how these all just kind of like painting a bigger picture of the Ancient Age, because it's an age we know a lot about, but it's a lot of speculation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of speculation. I think these next couple episodes are just going to be a little bit more of that, which is fine.
But that was my main purpose there, was just kind of like paint this picture of what the Ancient Age.
Right. Well, let's move a little bit into what we always talk about in every single episode.
The Blight?
The first Blight, specifically. Okay.
But you can't talk about the dwarves without talking about
I know. So, and we're not gonna spend a ton of time here, because we know what happens, right? Like the darkspawn take over. Like that's what happens. But like we've talked about in every other episode so far, the first blight is devastating. And that's not truer anywhere other than the Dwarven Empire, other than Orzammar, right? So during the first blight, the Dwarven Empire is decimated. Like, they're the front lines. They're dealing with this way before the surface is dealing with this. And I don't have the specific dates. I'm not sure the specific dates even really exist. But the Dwarven Empire starts crumbling. Orzammar basically shuts itself off from everyone else in the Empire, which kind of screws everyone. And we will dig into a little bit more of that history next week. But yeah, the first blight is devastating, and they kind of keep the Empire afloat after the first blight, but like it's crumbling, like they're trying really hard, but every time they go to rebuild, it just like kind of turns to dust,
Yeah. Well, I think there's a conversation in Origins you can have with either some noble or a Legion of the Dead member when you talk about like your need for the Darkspawn, and the Legion of the Dead is basically like, we fight Darkspawn all the time. Like, this is what we do. And there's like this feeling of like, when you all push back your blight, guess where the Darkspawn go?
They come to the dwarves. Right. And like, that was going to be my next point, because like whenever we've talked about the other blights in our other episodes, it's usually we have a very specific or clear end date. There's usually a final battle, and we can usually tell you which Grey Warden killed the Archdemon and the Darkspawn dissipated in the next year or so. Usually that's how it goes, but we can't do that in this, because the Darkspawn dissipate from the surface, and then they go back down underground, and Orzammar and the rest of these thaigs at that point are still dealing with this. It's an ever-present threat. I think there's nothing that illustrates this more clearly than in Dragon Age Origins. I can't remember when it happens, but it may be just a random kind of scene. But whenever you leave Orzammar and go into the Deep Roads, at times there will be just like a group of Darkspawn right outside that entrance to the Deep Roads that you then fight. And that's so clear to me. Like, it's right there. It's right there. Like, you're at the gates of Orzammar. You're right next to the assembly. You're right next to where they keep the memories. Like, it's right there. And it's just very clear to me that, okay, this is an ever-present threat. Like, this is not some ambiguous, far-off thing. Like, this is something that they deal with every single day of their lives.
Yeah.
So, in the first blight, they try as much as they can to fight the Darkspawn. And despite any victory they had, it just wasn't enough. So by -15 ancient, the kingdom of Orzammar assumed that they were the last ones standing, even though we know that they were not. They assumed that. So they basically shut everything down, acted as if they're the only ones. It's over. They knew that the thaigs surrounding Orzammar fell very easily to the Darkspawn. So they just assumed that that's what happened everywhere else. And that's really when it started the kind of downhill turn to where we're at today. And that's for a lot of different reasons. First, the warrior caste dwindles with every generation, which makes total sense, Right. As more and more of the able-bodied warriors go out to fight Darkspawn, more of them are going to die against the Darkspawn. And there's only so much repopulation you can be doing when you live underground, when there's a limited amount of food, when there's a limited amount of space and you're in the middle of a war, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the point of, like, I know I'm jumping just a little bit ahead, just really brief, but, like, that's Balin's whole point.
Right.
Is that we have to change, we have to reform and open some kind of contact with the surface world, because this is not, what we're doing is not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. People. Exactly. And I think it would be totally different if they didn't have all of these kind of rules and regulations surrounding their nobility. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but, you know, when you're casting out all of these people out of their families, out of their castes for, you know, whatever, all the different rules they have, it's like, well, you're casting out able-bodied people, you know? Who's going to go fight the Darkspawn if you're casting out a bunch of people? You know, it's just a numbers game that does not make sense to me. But anyways, so with each generation, more and more of the deep roads has to be sealed. And we see that again throughout the games. And as more and more of the deep roads are sealed, more and more thaigs are lost forever, which means, you know, the Dwarven Empire continues to be diminished. But there is one bright shining spot that the dwarves, for a long time, had hope in, had faith in, and that is the golems. So in minus 255, the Paragon Caridin, he makes the first golem. And we know that a golem is a giant soldier of, like, living stone and metal and all this stuff. And, like, it's super powerful. So with Caridin's golems, the dwarves began to retake some of the lost lands, which is awesome. But, you know, after like 5 or 6 years of like constantly creating more and more golems, Caridin and his Anvil of the Void vanished without a trace. And with them, the process of manufacturing golems also disappeared. So if you haven't played Origins, this is a main quest in the game. We find out what happened to Caridin. We find out what happened to the golems. We find out what the golems are made out of. And this is a major spoiler alert. We're not going to get into the whole quest, but golems basically are made from people. Like, you have to have a soul to make a golem. So
they're kind of like Horcruxes.
Kind of.
Yeah, except you're putting someone else's soul into
an
object as opposed to your own.
Right. But is it also an object? Like, a golem is living, you know?
Right.
But it is a little bit similar. But is it
living before the soul comes into it?
I don't know. Right, I don't know. These are the questions. We could debate that for like hours.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we won't get into this quest. I think most people probably know it anyways. But because they lost the process of making golems, you know, this kind of goes back into this cycle where they have a win and then they lose to the Darkspawn, and then so on and so forth. Like, it's just kind of an eternal push and pull between the dwarves and the Darkspawn. So, you know, like, the biggest existential fear for the dwarves is that they're going to become extinct because of the Darkspawn one day. And I think that's a very fair fear.
I mean, and you really see that in their culture, because, like, their supreme fighting force against the Darkspawn is called the Legion of the Dead, because when you join it, you're basically signing over that, like, I'm basically signing my death right now.
Right.
All right, so that's ancient history.
Yes.
What about, let's get into a little bit of the modern history, which I know we're not going to get big into because we experience a good deal of it in the games.
Yeah, but there are a few things I want to talk about. First is lyrium. I just don't think that Orzammar could even exist anymore without the sale of lyrium. They're the only ones, like Orzammar, the official government capacities are the only ones that are allowed to sell lyrium outside of Orzammar, and they only sell it to the Chantry until Inquisition. So that's a huge deal. That's a huge profit for them. So that's super important. But in Tevinter, fun fact, it's been known that lyrium can command a higher price point than a diamond.
Makes sense.
Yes, makes sense. But dwarves actually, like we talk about, this is their main source of income, but they actually sell very little of their lyrium to the surface, giving a greater portion of what they mine to their own smith caste, who use it in the forging of all of their dwarven weapons and armor and runes and all of that stuff. So, again, like I said, what lyrium is sold to the surface only goes through the Chantry, and then they strictly control that supply. So the Chantry then dispenses the lyrium to Templars, who make use of it in, fighting blood mages and stuff, and to the Circle, who obviously mages use it. So
in Inquisition,
that's a big part. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's
in
go ahead.
Inquisition, is it Josephine who negotiates the lyrium trade between Orzammar and the Inquisition?
I would assume so. She's the only one that makes sense
to do
that.
It makes sense. I'd have to go look. I think because there is a lot of war table operations that deal with Orzammar. Like, if you're wondering what the dwarves are doing during the events of Inquisition, you look at these war table operations. Yeah. And there's a lot of them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other dwarven war table missions in the other side of the map over by Tevinter, which we'll get into next week as well.
Yes. And so, the argument I would probably use if I was talking to him is you sell to the Chantry. The Chantry is in disarray. We're basically an arm of the Chantry. So you're just selling to the same people. Right.
But lyrium, as that's a huge part of how modern dwarves interact with the surface. And then I also, they've got a major role in the events of the Fifth Blight, right? Like they send, groups to help fight the Blight and defeat the demon to defeat the archdemon along with the hero of Ferelden. So that's a major player as well. That's significant. But what I really want to talk about right now for the next couple of minutes is about their culture. And I really wanted to focus and talk about class and that kind of interplay, because there's nowhere else that the divide between the nobility and the regular person is as stark. And yeah, we can talk about Orlais and we can talk about Tevinter all we want to, but I still think that the division between the nobility and the regular people of the dwarves is way more of a stark divide than any of the human nations.
In Tevinter, there's an ability, no, you might not be able to move yourself into the magisterium, but you can navigate yourself among the other classes within Tevinter.
Yeah.
Their names are escaping me right now, but the other lesser magic classes, if you're basically if you're a child whose parents are non-magical and you're born with magic, you immediately rise in status.
Right, and there's the distinction between the magisters, and then there's the other mages who are part of it. Right. So if you could work yourself up and become one of those mages, you might not become the Archon, you might not become an official magister, but maybe your child could. Maybe your grandchild could. I don't think the same can be said of the dwarves.
Right. And no, so I just finished, when I did my last playthrough of Origins, I was a dwarf. Mm-hmm. And if you do the noble background, you're obviously a part of the noble cast, and we'll get through the casts in a minute. But if you play the commoner, you're castless, which is the biggest shame you could ever have in Orzammar. And only the assembly can move your class.
Wow.
Your caste.
So do they do that for the commoner origin?
Yes. So after the events of Origin, you are granted membership into the warrior caste and made a paragon.
Right.
Which I think is annoying, but...
Why do you think that's annoying? I think it would be really meaningful that a casteless person could become a paragon.
Right. That's why I think that is one of the reasons that they give you a caste in the warrior, is because there's no denying what you've done or feats worthy of a paragon, but they don't want to make a casteless a paragon, so they make you.
So they give you nobility.
They give you one.
Yeah, that's fair. That is annoying. But I mean, like 90% of the quests you do in Origins. But seriously, like 90% of these quests are about, oh, my dad kicked me out of our caste, of our family, because I had a baby with someone he didn't approve of, or...
Oh, no. And, like, that's another thing is, like, it's traced for, like, even if you are a noble woman who, you know, gets impregnated by a casteless person, your baby is casteless.
Right. Which is interesting. But yeah, so I think this whole class issue is really a defining factor of the dwarves. And I mean, you really see it in like every dwarf we meet almost. Like Varric and Bartrand don't talk about it in this way, but like why else are they fighting and fighting and fighting so hard to become wealthy in the Deep Roads expedition, to have status in Kirkwall? Because they got kicked out of Orzammar, so they want to make something of themselves. I think that urge to, okay, I want to be the best that I can be and work toward this goal, whether or not it's attainable, is very central to dwarven culture.
Right. And so just before we get any more of like talking about it, let's talk about what are the castes in dwarven culture. Like there's 3, I believe, or 4.
Okay, why don't you tell me about them?
So you obviously at the top is the noble caste, where, you know, the royal, like the assembly and all those, they're part of the noble caste. Then there's 2 kind of like what I would call like a middle class, which are the merchant caste and the warrior caste. And then, and the smith caste, I think, yes, smith. I'll have to double check that. And then casteless is on the
right.
But I think it's interesting that the caste system that they put together is based on what Orzammar provides to the rest of Thedas. Other than the noble caste, like smithing. Smithing might be included in the merchant class.
No, they're different. They're different.
Okay. But like smithing, trade,
right,
and then they're warriors, like,
right.
It's very much strikes me about like Orzammar and the dwarves have at least, well, I guess we'll talk about maybe if Kalsharok, we'll learn next week if they have a similar caste system or not. But in Orzammar, it's very much this thing about like, okay, these are what we're known for, these are what they're good at, this is what we can do.
Right.
And like, I think Varric sometimes has a comment either with Bethany or something where he says like, yeah, not all dwarves are, you know, smiths or, you know, merchants or warriors or something like that. And you have I believe anyone of any caste can join the shape.
No.
Or are they their own caste?
No, they're not their own. But why do you think a casteless could join the Shaperit?
Well, I'm not including the casteless.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I don't know the answer to that question then.
Yeah. And so like the important things, it tells you a lot of like what Orzammar views as important, which is their nobility, obviously, their trade, their craft, and their warriors.
Lyrium. And their lyrium.
And their lyrium. And then there is an added, like, if you don't want to be involved in all of that, you can do the sacred duty of preserving what we were and the knowledge of our history.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, that being so, like, because of this strong caste system and the strong sense of identity, I think that one of the dwarves and elves do have a lot of kinship in that they both come from fallen empires. But I think what really separates the dwarves from the elves, other than like the obvious height difference, is the sense of identity, like, and the sense of history. Dwarves are very, very strong put in that we are dwarves.
Right, but also the elves, like, they don't have any of what the dwarves still. The dwarves can still go and say, okay, this is what it used to be like. The elves, they don't even know what it used to be like.
Right. And so, like, that's one of the big, like, distinctions I feel in between those groups. And, like, that is definitely a factor, that the dwarves know their history, so it creates a stronger sense of identity. So this sense of, like, caste and identity of the dwarves plays strongly in how they interact with the surface world.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's move into our middle section.
Yeah, let's do that. And then we'll come back and finish out the episode and get to our side character.
Yeah.
All right. So here's the middle part of the show where we let you know what's going on with the show. The first thing we want to remind you all of is that we did start a Patreon. We talked about it in detail in last week's episode. The different tiers you can join there. You can contribute anywhere from $5 all the way up to, if you really want to be really generous, $100. And there are different rewards and benefits you can get from each tier. If you feel so led, if you want to contribute to that, we would greatly appreciate it. You can find the link in our episode description, as well as the link to the Robots Radio Discord. And if you don't feel like you can support us financially in a monetary way, we love the listens, we love the downloads, we love getting reviews on Apple Podcasts is a great way to support our podcast. And I believe, speaking of reviews, we do have a new review to read today.
Yes, we do. This one is from Courier7, and he says, "Love this podcast. This podcast is very fun and very informative. I just recently decided to start listening, and I'm really enjoying the lore of the Dragon Age universe very much."
Awesome. Thank you so much, Courier7, for your review. All right, you want to get back into it, Shelby?
Yes.
All right, let's go.
Okay, so we talked about, in the first half, about all of the thaigs that have fallen. We are going to talk about like 7 of those in the next 2 weeks. So today I'm just going to talk about 2 or 3. So there is first Aeducan thaig, and Aeducan thaig was once home to the powerful House Aeducan, who is, the father, that house of the potential King Balin. But this thaig has been lost to the Darkspawn, and you can actually go to this area in the dwarf noble origin. It's actually called the Ruined Thaig, not the Aeducan thaig. But you can go to this one.
I believe that, I don't want to spoil it for you because you said you wanted to play it. But I believe you do know it's the Aeducan thaig. It might not be called that.
I think you do. I think you do know.
Yeah. Like your father, King Aeducan, and even Balin or your other brother, they all say, like, oh, it's our thaig.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And then the next one is Amgarrak. I think I'm pronouncing that one correctly, but Amgarrak was once a forge thaig where the smiths sought researching and like they wanted to replicate and improve Caridan's work on the golems. So they were really trying to like alter and study the existing golems. But contact with this thaig was lost under mysterious circumstances. And the research that happened in this thaig was led by a Tevinter mage known as Nerida and an unnamed dwarven noble. So we find out all of this information in Dragon Age Origins DLC, The Golems of Amgarrak. And so you go to this thaig in that DLC. Okay, the next one. Should I do 2 more or 1 more?
Let's just do 1 more. And why don't we do Ortan thaig?
Oh, no, let's do 2 more because we should do Ortan and Bownammar. Okay, so the next one is Bownammar, which is also known as the City of the Dead. And it is the headquarters of the Legion of the Dead, or at least it was. This fortress has been lost and claimed and lost again and reclaimed and lost again so many times that the Shaperate literally can't even track them all. Like, that's not an exaggeration. They cannot track how many times it's been lost and reclaimed. But it was permanently lost in 913 Dragon, so it's now called the Dead Trenches. And it was originally designed by Caridan. But this is the area in Origins. We can't go to Bownammar, but we walk by it. So when you're going into the deep roads for the final time to find Branka, you encounter the Legion of the Dead, and they're all just like kind of standing in a line, like ready to fight the Darkspawn that are coming. And they're standing in front of the gate and door and big thing behind them. That's the entrance to Bownammar. So this is kind of a sacred space, really, I think, especially for the Legion, but just for the dwarves in general. There's a lot of side banter about, I can't believe the Darkspawn are in there, you know, in this place that's so meaningful kind of stuff. So this one is a big loss.
I mean, it's the last thaig that's lost, really, like permanently, I guess, because 913 Dragon is just a couple years before the events of DAO.
Yeah, it's just like 2 decades, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Ortan thaig. So this one is another lost thaig that's very close to Orzammar, and you go through it to get to Branka, again, as several of these were. But this one is also a quest, and you can meet a girl named Orta in the Shaperate, and she begs you to help her find proof of her noble heritage so that she and her family can be restored to nobility status. And you're kind of like, okay, whatever. And she's like, yeah, I know my name is Ortan. Like that, like that's crazy. But she basically begs you to help her, and you can find evidence. And then, you know, you take it back to the Shaperate and she becomes a noble again. And I think they like lead an expedition there to like uncover some artifacts and stuff. But those are the 4 thaigs that we're going to talk about this week. And next week we'll talk about 3.
Well, so we're going into our side character, and this side character is also a side quest that you can get in Orzammar when you go there to DAO. And depending on what you do, I guess it doesn't really determine her outlook in later games, but you can meet a dwarf who begs you to get her to study at the Circle of Magi. Mm-hmm. And her name is Dagna, who does make a reappearance in Dragon Age Inquisition as your enchanter.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about Dagna.
Yes, so our side character is Dagna, and I really love Dagna in Origins. I just thought she was so cute and so spunky, and I was like, of course I'll go to the circle for you. I'll turn around right now and do it.
Right.
So I really like her, but let's talk about her family history and background a little bit. So, according to Dagna's father, her family has been part of the Smith caste for over 100 generations.
Wow.
And Dagna doesn't give two craps about this lineage. She doesn't want to be a Smith. She doesn't want to be restricted to Orzammar. And she feels really misunderstood. And so she is obsessed almost with any newcomer that comes to Orzammar. And so that's when she kind of begs the hero of Ferelden to help her travel to the Circle of Magi to study magic. And of course, this is a weird request because we know that dwarves cannot do magic. She cannot use magic, but she wants to learn about it to help her understand lyrium better, to help her understand, runes and magical items better, all this kind of stuff. So she has really big dreams, and I love that.
Yeah. She definitely, and you see just the passion. I think I feel a lot of empathy with Dagna because, we've all kind of been that thing where, we have a dream or we have something that we want to do and we want to do it so badly that we would give anything to do it. And Dagna kind of personifies that for us. In a
that's
person.
so true.
That desire to I will do anything to do this.
Yeah, that's so true. And she's willing to, she is willing to do anything because she gives up everything to do this. She gives up her status in Orzammar. She becomes a surface dwarf. Her father does not support her leaving, and if you do the quest and help her leave, he just every time you go in his store, he basically won't talk to you and just yells at you to get out.
Right.
So she gives up everything. She gives up her family. She probably gives up whatever money she had. I'm sure she didn't have enough because she is a teenager and the circle would provide for her if she lived there. But, she gives up everything, every relationship, every parental figure, every family friend, every sibling she has, even her religion, which, that's a big deal. All these things, she's got to give them all up to go live among humans and elves on the surface.
Right. And this is an important thing, and we actually didn't get to it in the episode, but I'll say it now. If you're banished to the surface or you leave the surface and go back, you can never return to Orzammar.
Mm-hmm.
In Origins, the only reason that you as a dwarf are able to return to Orzammar is because of your Grey Warden status.
Right. Exactly.
And it's a huge deal, and it's it would be a huge step because she's basically saying, yeah, I'll never see my family.
Right. And that's how you know it's so serious to her, because she's willing to sacrifice all that. And we can talk this up to teenage rebellion, but I really think that it goes so much deeper than that.
Right. And she comes to play this huge role, and what she learns and what she learns how to does can have big impacts on what you can accomplish in Inquisition when she becomes your enchanter, because it's Dagna who develops the thing to break Samson's armor or cracks the way to track
Calpurnia.
Calpurnia's communication thing to find the old mage and give you the needs to make Calpurnia turn against Gryphius. It's all these things that you can get, and Dagna's the one who helps you do that.
Right.
And I know that a lot of people were upset that we didn't have Sandal to be our enchantment person in Inquisition, But like I, for one, love the addition of Dagna and the like seeing the end result of like she did learn to go really deal with magic.
Yeah, and she has some real accomplishments. Like she writes this apparently the epilogue, if you help her, the epilogue states that she writes a, quote, comprehensive theory of how lyrium vapors relate to the supply of magic. So she writes this huge paper, and then she becomes the arcanist in the Inquisition. And in between that, she works at several different circles, and she even goes to Tevinter and the Free Marches, and then she makes herself all the way over back to Ferelden into the Inquisition. But she's got some real skills. Like, she's not just this unique person that's like, oh, okay, cool, like you're a dwarf that's interested in magic, like, okay, you're a token interesting person. No, like she's actually really good at what she does.
Right. And I think I was just gonna say, like, so what she ends up doing is Ivring basically says, oh, she can come study with the Tranquil, which, if you didn't know, Tranquil in the Circle of Magi study enchantment and how to enchant weapons, armor, or other items. So like Dagna goes and she learns with the Tranquil, which I just think is funny because she's so spunky and like
and animated
to go and just sit with a bunch of Tranquil.
I know. I would just love to see that in a sitcom. Like that would be hilarious. I can like literally see it now. Like, oh my gosh, that would be so funny. Anyway,
and like they talk about like that, her work rivals that of all of the great enchanters of the Circle. And Dagna, and I think what helps Dagna in this is her knowledge of smithing. Like, ironically, the fact that she comes from the smith caste helps her.
I agree with that. Yes.
Understand enchantment better.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anything else about Dagna? I know we both really love her.
We do. Well, thank you for lifting up the two things about Samson and Calpurnia. I was going to mention those. And then there's a couple other things. If the Inquisitor does not romance Sarah, then Sarah and Dagna enter into a relationship.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, I really like that. And then she makes an appearance in Tevinter Nights in, I think it's the chapter Callback. So basically what happens is that she becomes part of the reinforcements that Sutherland and his company they go back to Skyhold. There's like a demon there. And so Dagna goes with them to kind of fight this demon. And so she appears in that. And then I have one little quote that I wanted to lift up from Dagna. And she says, "There's no barriers to what magic can do, Inquisitor, no matter what they say." And I just really like that. I think that perfectly sums up Dagna's personality.
Right. I really hope that we get some kind of interaction between her and Volta.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, the implications of what happens at the end of the Descent DLC, I think, are huge for the Dwarven people, especially because we basically, even the Inquisitor can say, like, did you just use magic? Like, and it just will be interesting to see that interplay. And I would just think that, like, it would be interesting to see the dynamic between the two.
Yes. Yeah, I'll be really interested to see what they do with both Dagna and Volta in Dragon Age 4. Because I do think there is potential for them to open the door to dwarves being able to practice magic between the two of them.
Right. Do you have anything else about Dagna?
I don't.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. We'll continue our Dwarven talk in our part 2 while we talk about Khal Sharrock, which will be a lot of interesting things coming your ways. So yeah, we'll see you next time on the Dragon Age Lorecast. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. As always, you can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast. If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, email them to us at dalorecast@gmail.com. The Dragon Age Lorecast is a part of the Robots Radio Rocket Club. You can join the Robots Radio Network Discord by clicking the link in our episode description. If you enjoyed our show, we'd love it if you'd subscribe and give us a review. See you next time.
Do you love Dragon Age? Have you always wanted to learn more about its vast world and detailed lore? Are you still attached to your hero of Ferelden, even a decade after Dragon Age Origins came out? Or maybe you're a newer fan, still discovering a new tidbit or quest every day.
Well, either way, the Dragon Age Lorecast is the podcast for you. I'm Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm Shelby, also known as She-Cup.
And come and join us as we embark on a journey to explore and discover all things Dragon Age.
We'll discuss all kinds of topics, from Lyrium to the Chantry and the great mysteries of the old gods, and even more that even you BioWare superfans might not know about.
So come and listen on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. And always remember,
swooping